Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we're going to be talking about California's ecosystems, especially the University of California's Natural Reserve System, with my guest, Dr. Mike Hamilton. He is owner of Canemah Nature. He is now retired as the director and academic coordinator of the Blue Oak Ranch Reserve with the University of California at Berkeley's Natural Reserve System, and he was the former director and principal museum scientist at the James Jacinto Mountains Reserve in part of the University of California's Riverside Natural Reserve System. He is a member of numerous associations, a member of the board of directors, including the founding member of the Mount San Jacinto Natural History Association. He has served on many community organizations' boards and advisory councils, and has received numerous honors and awards for his ecological research and work. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you back on Environmental Directions.
Hi, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It has been a long time since I first met you up in the San Jacinto Mountains of the San Bernardino National Forest in Idlewild, which is the mountain that one can see from Palm Springs between Banning and Hemet. You did a lot of incredible work studying and preserving the wildlife and natural area of that place. Let's begin with what the James Reserve is and why is it named that?
The James Reserve is one of today over 40 biological field stations, which are places that the university has established with permanent protection to protect the natural ecosystems and species for study by our faculty and our students, as well as any associated, professionally interested and relevant people. So the James was actually the very first of the field stations established in 1965, and it had previously been owned by a private family, by the man Harry James and his wife, and they ran a private school for boys in Los Angeles, a very successful one in the 1920s through the 1950s. And they made the James Reserve their retirement home. And it's just a delightful location right upstream from Lake Fillmore, the Banning-Idlewild Highway, about 9 miles from Idlewild, and has served the needs of literally tens of thousands of students and faculty.
How many native plants and animals can be found there?
As an ecologist, you sort of divvy up the planet based on the size of the areas. So the James itself is only 30 acres, so on it proper, there may be 300 species of plants, 110 species of birds, probably 500 plus species of insects and vertebrates. But the next sort of unit that we look at is the watershed. And so the entire watershed surrounding the James Reserve was successfully put into a category called the Hall Canyon Research Natural Area. That's a U.S. Forest Service designation. But it keeps them from doing anything in that watershed. So no logging, no modification of the environment. It has to be protected for its natural values. And so we agreed to be cooperative managers of that property, and we advocated for it, of course. It was in our best interest. So by 1985, we had that roughly 1,000-acre area set aside and protected permanently as it is today. And then that butts up nearly to the boundary of the San Jacinto Wilderness Area. And those are two very large, good-sized protected areas that have been protected since the 1930s. So there's a federal area and there's a state area. So within that, the James Reserve, there's probably 800 species of plants and 300 plus species of vertebrates and, thousands of species of insects throughout the San Jacinto Mountains.
What is going on in terms of reintroducing some of the species in the San Jacinto Mountains? For example, the bears were all killed by the 1950s. Are they going to be reintroduced?
Any species reintroduction really has to be evaluated and tested on a case-by-case basis. You can't make assumptions about whole groups of ecosystems, species in an ecosystem, and their survivability given today's land use patterns of people. So the San Jacinto is an island, really. It's ecologically been an island even before humans came around because it's surrounded by a different climate zone, Colorado Desert to the east and sort of Mediterranean and sage ecosystems to the west. And so you have this conifer forest sticking up. And so really for its entire history, it's been a transient value to wildlife that migrated across these landscapes. So obviously, California, the state animal is the grizzly bear, and that's a variety of brown bear, closely related to the ones that exist today in Alaska and, in the northern parts of the U.S. But in California, it was really abundant, and it was very widespread species. It could live down in the lowlands along the coast. It could forage all the way up to the top of mountain ranges. I mean, it's a really powerful, amazingly adaptable animal. So today, it would just be impossible to reintroduce grizzly to California because there's just too many people and too many conflicts. Black bears were introduced. They are native to the Sierras, but never to Southern California. But they were introduced in the 50s to the San Gabriel Mountains and the San Bernardino Mountains. And they've been really successful. And so in the San Jacinto, they come and go because there just isn't enough food habitat for them to support them, even on the national forest. The more endangered species that I worked with were the spotted owls, which was a unique California species of the northern spotted owl, and the Southern California mountain yellow-legged frog, which was a species of amphibian closely related to a similar sounding species, the Sierra mountain yellow-legged frog, all of which are endangered due to a variety of factors. They've caught introduced diseases. There's this thing called the chytrid fungus that they catch that kills them right and left and center. There's a shifting hydrology in the streams that they depend on. So there's just a lot more variability in how much water is available to them, and they can't really count on it anymore, in Southern California at least, because the watersheds are just so changed, and climate change has just been really severe in Southern California. It's been really difficult to reestablish them and then keep them going. And with the help of the Center for Conservation Biology at the San Diego Zoo, there's been an active breeding program for them and reintroduction program in the San Jacintos. But how successful it is right now, I haven't checked in with those folks in a few years, but I suspect they're seeing re-extinctions.
In the foothills of the mountains, one can find the endangered Stevens kangaroo rat. How high up in elevation can that species be found? And how do you justify to people who say we shouldn't be saving land for a rat? Why is the rat important?
For one thing, it's actually a squirrel. So if they just change the name, it might help its cause.
Terminology makes a big difference.
It's like saving a cockroach versus a butterfly. It's a lot easier to save the butterfly. Well, the Stevens kangaroo rat is limited to lower elevation grassland and coastal sage communities. And so it's not in the San Jacinto Mountains proper. And its real prime habitat is in the most valuable real estate in western Riverside County. There have been a long-term effort to protect those habitats, and those reserves, in a sense, are an experiment. Are they big enough to allow the species to, regenerate and to sustain itself? It's a biological question, and you only know by studying it over time.
There are about 40 reserves in that University of California system. Perhaps give us a highlight, if we went up and down California, what the natural reserve system is protecting, and where are they and what are they?
The goal of the program was to create an ecosystem library of California. So our faculty have been really diligent about trying to identify opportunities to connect, either with outright purchase or with collaboration and co-management with existing land ownerships. For example, we most recently added some federal properties up on Mount Lassen National Park that included lava bed ecosystems because we didn't have any lava fields in our program. But we spanned the coast to the deserts, over the crest of the Sierras in various transects, meaning that in Southern California, you can go from San Diego, a saltwater estuary, to freshwater estuaries, to chaparral and riparian at our Elliott Reserve. We have the property that's below water at the Scripps Pier, so underwater intertidal ecosystems. If you go out to the sea, we have in the Channel Islands, there's 2 of the Channel Islands have UC reserves on them. Santa Cruz Island, very large protected area with the Nature Conservancy owning most of it, as well as in the Bay Area on the Farallones. If you go up toward the mountain ranges, we have obviously the James Reserve in the San Jacinto Mountains. We have the Elliott Oaks Reserve over on the Fox Hills area above campus. We go into the Mojave Desert. One of our oldest and largest field stations is called Boyd Deep Canyon Desert Research Center. It was donated by Phil Boyd, who was then the mayor of Palm Springs and later became chancellor at UC Riverside. That's 17,000 acres protected. That's part of that entire watershed that goes all the way up to the top of Santa Rosa Peak and down to Palm Desert. Further out in the desert is the Granite Mountains Reserve, 8,000 acres protected. That's in the middle of the national park, out in Mojave National Park. Going up the east side, we have reserves near Mammoth Mountain, one on the watershed of Convict Lake, another one in Lake Mary and Twin Lakes area above Mammoth. Further up in the Sierras, we have the Seychen Reserve that's near Truckee and near Donner Pass, 8,000 acres cooperatively managed with the Forest Service. If you wind your way back to the west from there's Blue Oak Ranch, is the Hastings Natural History Reserve, which is near Carmel Valley. Heading north up toward the Eel River is the Angelo Reserve, old growth Douglas fir, rainforest, really beautiful, incredible site, 3,000 or 4,000 acres in size.
What natural reserve systems would we find in Northern California?
So I mentioned the Angelo Reserve. That's near the town of Laytonville if you go up to 101. And it's a watershed that's part of the Eel River, and that's one of our most busiest and highest research productivity. There's millions of dollars worth of research going on there. They can literally track raindrops from the time that it's released in the atmosphere through how it penetrates bedrock and ends up in the ocean. They use very advanced technologies called isotopes to do that sort of tracing. But they study the food webs of the animals as well, the whole interface between the terrestrial and the aquatic. There isn't a whole lot in the far northwest part of California. It kind of gives you a flavor of how much diversity we have. I mean, it's deserts, it's mountains, it's coastal, it's shrublands, it's grasslands.
Fantastic resources. You have worked statewide. You have worked with the California Statewide Natural Diversity Database, part of the California State Department of Fish and Game. You've worked with the California Native Plant Society, the California Ecological Observatory Network, the National Science Foundation Review Panels, the Society for Conservation, and many other organizations working on ecosystem protection. But let's mention one other reserve system, part of the University of California, Berkeley's Natural Reserve System, and that's the Blue Oak Ranch Reserve. Where is that? What is that? And why is it important?
Yeah. You know, Nancy, I was hardcore devoted to San Jacinto Mountain, so it's going to take something really spectacular to drag me, to pull my roots up and get me to relocate to a different part of the state. And it just happened to be Blue Oak Ranch. At that time, it was a privately donated nearly 4,000 acres of oak woodland grassland with hundreds of wetlands, ponds, riparian corridors. It had salmonids spawning up one of the major watersheds. There were a dozen different endangered species that were flourishing there, not just barely making it, but species like the California tiger salamander, the Alameda whip snake, a number of plants, insects. It was an amazing place. It's located exactly east of San Jose, only about 10 miles as the crow flies, and it's up on Mount Hamilton. So, you know, of course, I had to go to my mountain.
Yeah, named after you, but you claim, well, but I think it was named after somebody else.
It certainly was, but, you know, it always gives me a chuckle to think that I ended up on Mount Hamilton, you know, protecting this amazing piece of property. And the whole notion was that we could set up a new field station and a large, significant ecological reserve that could dramatically influence the conservation and environmental and ecological research opportunities in the Bay Area, and we've accomplished that. We had every opportunity to do it right, and it was my responsibility to develop this site from basically just a ranch, a privately owned cattle ranch with one barn on the property to a full-scale, environmentally sustainable field station with the capacity of housing anywhere from 50 to 80 students.
I was so pleased in the 1980s to do one of my first Eco News television documentaries at the James Reserve and see the good work that you were doing there and to follow you all these years. And I want to talk more about your work on preserving and protecting ecosystems when we return in a moment with my guest, Dr. Michael Hamilton.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Dr. Michael Hamilton, who is a research scientist who has been the director of the University of California's Natural Resources Systems Reserve at the Blue Oak Ranch Reserve and the James San Jacinto Mountains Reserve. But I also want to talk with you briefly about your work where you are now located in Oregon. You are owner of the Canemah Nature. You have served as vice chairperson of the Natural Resources Advisory Committee for Oregon City in Oregon. You are presently with the Clackamas Community College's Environmental Learning Center, a founding member of the Ecology Professionals Technical Advisory Committee. You work with the Playa Center for the Intersection of Art and Science with the Science Council. But tell me what Canemah means.
I moved to Oregon City after I retired. My kids live up here, my only granddaughter, and, they came up here to go to college and never left. So, I'm following them. Canemah is a Native American name by the Clackamas people, who were the original Native Americans who occupied this landscape around the Willamette River and the Willamette Falls. And the falls are a really big deal to them because it's a concentration of fisheries. Very, very tall waterfall, has almost as much water flowing over it as Niagara Falls. It's a place where all the migrating salmon go upstream up the Willamette River, which is a really, really major, huge watershed, the largest one in Oregon.
And a spectacular sight to see the salmon try to get over the falls.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so even today, the Federated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, which are the current Native American alliance of different sovereign nations that were all part of this location. They have recently purchased about 5 acres of the old industrial zone along the river to begin transforming it into a really wonderful place for their people and everyone in Oregon to come and visit and learn about their relationship with the falls and the natural resources, and then to be involved in the restoration of this habitat. Because Oregon City was the very first city established in the western U.S. It was the end of the Oregon Trail, and it was pretty much a Canadian project back then, but it set the roots for, our early U.S. growth and development of the West. It all spun off of this location. I chose the name Canemah because it means a canoe place. It's basically a location where the first settlers came to live in Oregon City. It's just a walking distance from my home, and for me, it's a platform to continue my outreach around the world with professionals that are interested in the research that I've done and some of the contributions I can still make to their research. I'm still very involved with other field stations. A lot of my early research involved putting live sensing systems and webcams and different forms of monitoring technology into wild places.
In fact, in looking at your pages and pages of your resume, I see grants from the National Science Foundation to work on monitoring and technology. You've done so much with converging technology, sensoring, robotics, imagers as biological sensors, sensor networks, camera use. Explain how all this new technology is being used in the field to study biology and botany.
Well, you're going to have to talk to me for about 3 or 4 days. We live in a technological world, and we've learned so much about networking and building systems that help us see more, to be a presence, whether humans are there or not. I mean, a lot of field biology is hampered by the mere fact that it's very labor intensive. It takes hours of singular observations by individuals to hopefully observe and capture the important things that happen in the outdoors. And yet the moment you leave, something important happens and you don't know about it. So the idea behind electronic and network sensing systems is that they're continuously vigilant. They're sentinels for streaming data and collecting it and using computers to help us identify what we may not have been able to see otherwise. And so it's to really branch off into learning about the previously unobservable and to make discoveries. And we've made many discoveries using this system. It's really quite spectacular. And today, we wouldn't even have a clue of how the world is changing and how we might go about correcting that if we didn't use these same technologies to understand how the Earth is changing, how environments and ecosystems and species are adapting or not adapting.
Parks, reserves are set aside generally for wildlife and ecosystem preservation and protection. And sometimes they're set aside for recreation as well. Sometimes human use, whether or not it's just hiking through an area, can disturb some of the scientific research. How do you manage the conflict between humans wanting to go into wild places and saving the wild places for the plants and animals?
Fortunately, most areas have a diversity of protected natural areas, some of which are open for recreation. And with that, you accept a bit of disturbance that can occur as a result of the recreational use. But then other areas, we really restrict that. And we act like park rangers, and we kick people out. And that's the way our natural reserve system is. The majority of our reserves are not open to the public. You have to get permission. You have to actually apply to visit and have your application approved in advance before you can enter. We do a good job. I mean, the environments are really least disturbed. The most disturbance is unfortunately due to invasive species, and then the occasional wildfire, which are increasing in California, but they'll move through an area and either lightly or heavily disturb it. My biggest challenges at Blue Oak were with wild hogs, which are incredibly damaging, and they're just like rototillers, and they just love earthworms. So they have a real impact on the understory, invasive species in many of our wetlands that we're trying to deal with, like bullfrogs.
How do you deal with the exotic introduced species that seem very often to take over the land and not make it accessible for the native species to survive?
Right. Well, all you can do is try everything possible. So I established hunting programs. I had volunteer hunters that would come in and shoot the pigs and the turkeys and the bullfrogs.
Some animal rights people might not be happy with that solution.
Well, we didn't advertise it. Hunting is still very much allowed and conducted just about everywhere. If they could come up with an alternative solution, but they aren't. They don't have the resources themselves to say, okay, we'll come in and trap them for you and find good homes for them. Well, you don't do that with a wild boar. They're really dangerous animals. There's a point where you have to be realistic. I've completely dedicated my life to conservation and protection, but that doesn't mean I don't accept life cycles of organisms. Everything is born and everything dies eventually. And so the more we mess up that cycle, the more out of whack things get. So it's really important for us to try to return some of these ecosystems to something closer to what their natural conditions were, but it may be impossible.
Are the governmental agencies that are responsible for land use management considering and taking into account in their decision-making the discoveries of the scientists? Because I know you have served on scientific advisory committees for groups such as the Riverside County Growth Management Element Policy Advisory Committee, the Riverside County Planning Department's Technical Advisory Committee on the Stevens Kangaroo Rat. You worked with the Coordinated Resources Management Planning Interagency Team in the San Jacinto Mountains of California, and numerous others from the State Department of Fish and Game and other agencies that have to decide how we take care of our resources. Are they really utilizing the new research and data?
Nancy, they're trying. Okay, it's hard. It's hard for scientists to keep up with how much change is happening. Fortunately, we live in a world where science is shared freely across the majority of the countries that scientists are working in. And they're able to publish electronically and be able to get information out for others to be able to review and scrutinize and accept or adopt.
You are certainly helping the new generation learn about the resources. You've done a lot of teaching about biology at many levels, high school, college. You want to be sure that our resources are protected. You've also worked on the ecosystems of the Feather River. Where is that, and why is that place important?
While I was at Blue Oak, I owned a small house in Sierra Valley, which is the headwaters of the Feather River. It's located north of Truckee, north of Reno. It's on the east side of the Sierra Nevada, so water flows from there into Nevada rather than toward the ocean. But at that part, the Feather River actually does make its way west through a gap in the Sierra Nevada. And that area is a true hotspot for birders. It attracted me because it's a place to see hundreds to thousands of sandhill cranes and all sorts of migratory water birds, as well as just an amazing abundance of raptors of all species, from eagles to hawks to falcons. Just a lovely place. That's where I had a home, and I, of course, spent time with the local land trust, helping them, advising them with stewardship activities and using technologies to better manage their lands.
You have been involved with many nonprofit organizations, from the California Native Plant Society, Society for Conservation. Are the various environmental and conservation groups working together to try and save our plants and animals?
Are they working together? Of course, they're collaborating. So probably my most interesting organization that I co-founded is called the Society for Conservation, GIS. And GIS is an acronym for Geographic Information System. So you think of them as your navigation apps on your phone. Well, underlying that is a huge database of geographic information that's laid out spatially and can be accessed through networks. And so we, since the 90s, have been promoting the use of that for understanding patterns of biological diversity and for assisting conservationists around the world in doing a better job managing species and advocating for conservation. That organization, in turn, has worked with the larger conservation organizations like the World Wildlife Fund or the Nature Conservancy or the Native Plant Society. So they all are using GIS today, but many of them got into it because we set them up with the technology, and we facilitated the donations and the training to allow them to move into using those tools. And this was 20 years ago for some of these organizations. So they all have now very sophisticated data managers to manage this information. But SCGIS is still alive and well, and we still give out grants to organizations around the world on an annual basis. Until COVID, we were doing on-site training in California, bringing people from over 100 different countries worldwide. They're sending their biologists to California to learn how to use these technologies. And then we'd send them back to their country so they could apply it.
It's important to use the new technology to try and help our planet. You've been in the field doing research. Did you fall in love with any special plant or animal?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's really hard. I'm still in love with the big old ponderosa pine at the James Reserve. I have to give it a hug every time I visit. I also have a really newfound love of California live oaks.
I want to thank you so very much for loving our natural world and sharing it with us, and for all your research work. Thank you for being my guest.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Nancy.
I have been speaking with Dr. Mike Hamilton, who is a biologist, ecologist, and research scientist and former director of some of the University of California's Natural Reserve Systems reserves. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.